This planet is dying. The human race is killing it.
So you've come here to help us?
No.
You said you came to save us.
I said I came to save the Earth.
You came to save the Earth. From us. You came to save the Earth. From us.
If the Earth dies, you die. If you die, the Earth survives.
We can change. We could still turn things around.
We've watched, we've waited and hoped that you would change.
Please.
It's reached the tipping point. We have to act.
Please.
We'll undo the damage you've done and give the Earth a chance to begin again.
Don't do that. Please. We could change. We can change.
The decision is made. The process has begun.
Oh, God.
This introduction tells us two things. Keanu Reeves knows how to pick impactful sci-fi movies, and concerning the topic of this episode, more or less, as we are joined by the sage David Fideler to discuss his mind-expanding, reality-dispanding book, Restoring the Soul of the World, Our Living Bond with Nature's Intelligence. Perfect for the first show of the year of our Demiurge 2015, on this early January, as humanity begins another cycle into oblivion.
Your problem is not technology. The problem is you.
Then help us change. I cannot change your nature.
Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio is an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult, culture, and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week I, your host, Abraxas, in his meat puppet incarnation of Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring you the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird. This is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in on. And now you can, because you have risen from the grave of amnesia, complacency, and propaganda that has made you the worm food for Jehovah and his rim jobs in the establishment, as well as kept your divine spark in the maggot muck of mere being.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad.
Welcome with kindness and love, as Jesus calls the first steps of the path of Gnosis in the Nag Hammadi Library's Dialogue of the Savior. Welcome to the desert of the real and a world without sin, where heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just is.
Yes, these are bruises from fighting. Yes, I'm comfortable with that. I am enlightened.
I like this quote by Dylan M. Burns on understanding the ancient Gnostics and how we can magically make their dark wisdom meaningful to our lives in the Black Iron Prison. It's from his excellent and recent book, Apocalypse of the Alien God, Platonism and the Exile of Sethian Gnosticism. It goes, Gnostic literature is blending state-of-the-art Greek metaphysics and ecstatic Jewish mysticism. These texts describe techniques for entering celestial realms, participating in the angelic liturgy, confronting the transcendent God, and even becoming a divine being oneself. They also describe the revelation of an alien God to his elect, a race of foreigners under the protection of the patriarch Seth, whose interventions will ultimately culminate in the end of the world.
Oh, you shouldn't even exist. I mean, we took out Cyberdyne over 10 years ago, but we stopped Judgment Day.
You only postponed it. Judgment Day is inevitable.
But back in this world that hasn't ended, and really hasn't begun, led us to this galvanizing show with David Fideler. David has graced the virtual Alexandria before to discuss his seminal book, Jesus Christ, Son of God, as well as Persian mysticism from his book, Love's Alchemy. Again, his new work is Restoring the Soul of the World. It's not some New Age milquetoast treatise on saving nature by making a lot of West Coast Caucasian rich and guilting communities of their collective testicles.
I want to become a guru so girls will like me. Then I will like myself.
No, Montresor. It's a sound exposition on how we can conjoin our active imagination with the active imagination of nature, which is full of divinity, while at the same time accessing the healing empathy of the collective unconscious, and then truly become divine redeemers as well as co-creators with a fallen universe in need of restoration and a new narrative. It draws from the wisdom of the great esoteric ancients and sensible scientific approaches. In other words, David's book is certainly in line with the ethos of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio.
If we have souls, they are made of the love we share. Undimmed by time, unbound by death.
Sure, the Gnostics hated on the material world in their writings. But once again, I must mention that they were employing myths to explain existential truths on the nature of suffering and reality. Zeus casting lightning bolts doesn't mean that you're going to get speared with 10,000 watts when you walk out the door. Perhaps. But that nature is fickle and still watch out when you walk out the door. I've also repeated that the Gnostics, especially the Manichaeans and Cathars, were very eco-friendly, seeing divinity in every animal and even object. They were vegetarian and pacifists. Yes, the Gnostics saw us having divine sparks trapped in the bodies of dying mammals, as W.B. Yeats said. But that spark could only shine if we showed compassion and understanding towards all that was around us. Unlike the Descartes/Newtonian worldview David will discuss in our interview and is still plaguing us today. As the secret book of James says, hearken to the Logos, understand Gnosis, love life.
Because if we can't protect the Earth, you can be damn well sure we'll avenge it.
We need to be free men and women. If we're not free, then we're no different than Cylons.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here and there, any assistance you might have, like marketing, design, or procuring for me the Lost Director's cut of Roadhouse.
Even the smallest person can change the course of the future.
Please don't forget to support my Patreon campaign, where you donate every time I produce. And together, we can continue growing one of the greatest heretical communities in the history of the multiverse. There are linkies at our homepage, thegodabovegod.com, that lead you to manners to support this Promethean venture. Your support is essential, and much appreciation to you Darth Maul's Redivivus who support this Red Pill cafeteria on a weekly basis. We're going to do so many wonders together. I just know it. I just know it. And we will restore the soul of the world. which in the Simonian myths is none other than Helen of Troy, or Helen of Tyane, or Sophia herself.
I am the beginning, the end, the one who is many.
And before we go to the interview with David Fideler, I'd like to recite this poem, which deals with our topic today, and the world soul, and Sophia. It's by Joan Zanko, and it's called Remembering. In the secret recesses of the heart, beyond the teachings of this world, calls a still small voice, singing a song unchanged from the foundations of the world. Speak to me in sunsets and in starlight. Speak to me in the eyes of a child. You who call from a smile, my cosmic beloved. Tell who I am and who I always will be. Help me remember that I am both the singer and the song. Hello and goodbye as always.
God's creature, right? God's special creature? Ha! And I've warned him, Kevin. I've warned him every step of the way. Watching him bounce around like a fucking game, like a wind-up toy, like 250 pounds of self-serving greed on wheels. The next 1,000 years is right around the corner, Kevin, and Eddie Barzoom. Take a good look. Excuse me. Because he's the poster child for the next millennium. These people, it's no mystery where they come from. You sharpen the human appetite to the point where it can split atoms with its desire. You build egos the size of cathedrals, fiber optically connect the world to every eager impulse, grease even the dullest dreams with these dollar green, gold-plated fantasies until every human becomes an aspiring emperor, becomes his own god. And where can you go from there? And as we're scrambling from one deal to the next, who's got his eye on the planet? As the air thickens, the water sours, even the bee's honey takes on the metallic taste of radioactivity. And it just keeps coming, faster and faster. There's no chance to think, to prepare. It's buy futures, sell futures, when there is no future. We got a runaway train, boy. We got 1 billion Eddie Barzooms all jogging into the future. Every one of them getting ready to fist fuck God's ex-planet, lick their fingers clean as they reach out toward their pristine, kybernetic keyboards to tote up their fucking billable hours. And then it hits home. You gotta pay your own way, Eddie. It's a little late in the game to buy out now. Your belly's too full, your dick is sore, your eyes are bloodshot, and you're screaming for someone to help. But guess what? There's no one there. You're all alone, Eddie. You're God's special little creature. Maybe it's true. Maybe God threw the dice once too often. Maybe he let us all down.
This is the Aeon Byte interview. And with us, we definitely have the pleasure of being joined again by David Fideler to discuss his new book, Restoring the Soul of the World, Our Living Bond with Nature's Intelligence. How are you doing today, David?
Well, I'm doing pretty well. Nice to speak with you again.
Likewise, David. Glad you could come back. And so tell us a bit on how you came to write Restoring the Soul of the World and your basic thesis and themes in it.
I started work on the book actually many years ago when I was studying the relationship between worldview, culture, and cosmology. And back at that time, I came to realize that our current worldview, that we're still sort of living in, the mechanistic worldview, was really the leading cause of the environmental crisis. Because we no longer think of the world as even being alive. And when we think about nature, we don't even talk about nature. We talk about the environment as if we don't even live in a living world. But it's sort of like this, clinical environment that we've somehow found ourselves in, by accident. And the book also deals with our own relationship with the world and what it means to be alive as human beings. Because when the world is no longer alive, we're no longer fully alive or or complete either. So I was reading a lot of books, about the mechanistic worldview and its cultural impact. And because of my background in the study of Greek philosophy, specifically Neoplatonism, I really understood what the ancient philosophers meant by living nature and nature's intelligence. So I felt that I sort of had a unique responsibility to write this book for a general audience, which explains these ideas of living nature and, as they used to call it, the world soul, and how this idea of living nature went into eclipse with the mechanistic worldview in the scientific revolution, and also how the mechanistic worldview has now broken down, and the new kinds of scientific ideas that we're seeing once again point toward the idea of a living world in which intelligence is present. So that's basically how the book, came about. I felt that there was a real need for it because, as you realize, people adopt these worldviews unconsciously, and it's very hard to look outside of them, and people always tend to assume that we've looked at the world in the same way that we look at it now, and that's just that's not the case. In fact, the whole idea of nature's intelligence, shows you. That doesn't quite sound right to the modern ear, and it shows you that we're really not used to thinking in that way. Whereas in earlier times, people thought in that way all of the time. That was the leading, worldview for around 700 years. Not continuously. Sometimes there were periods when it went into eclipse, but the idea of living nature and nature's intelligence was, the normative worldview in Western culture for, 700 or 800 years.
Yes, and as you explain in your book, you're not sort of coming up with some new age magic. This is something that the great Greek philosophers, the Neoplatonists, the Hermetics, the Stoics, everybody thought that we were sort of connected into one universe. And as you say, this universe had one intelligence. And as the title of your book says, there is the theme of the world soul. What exactly is the world soul, David?
Plato was the first person to use the term world soul, or in the Greek it's actually soul of the cosmos. And but this idea of living nature and nature's intelligence actually goes back before Plato. And maybe I could talk about that just a little bit, because
Sure.
I think some people have a problem with this idea of nature's intelligence, what's really meant by it. And sort of at its very simplest level, nature's intelligence, it refers to the active pattern forming power present in nature. And so you have this two ideas. You have an idea of activity and you have an idea of form. And the Greek word psyche or psyche means life. And for the early Greek philosophers, it meant the activity of movement. So basically, any form of movement is a form of life. When something stops moving, it's dead. And because of that, they saw all of this movement taking place in the world, and the movement of the heavens and the stars turning and the planets and everything like that. So they saw this as evidence of life, or the cosmos being ensouled. And the other factor is intelligence. And if we look at living things, we see that they possess forms and patterns. And for the Greeks, form is a reflection of intelligence. So if you look at the patterns of nature, or the patterns of living things, we see sort of like a deployment of order and form. And order and form are strategies of organization. And anything that possesses a strategy also possesses some kind of intelligence. So if we look at living things, there's an ancient Greek philosopher, Epicharmus of Kos, who's pretty obscure, but he said, 2,500 years ago, that everything that is alive is intelligent, and that's still true today. So, for example, if you cut your hand, your body knows how to repair itself, and you see this all throughout, the natural world. If you take a flatworm and cut it into pieces, it will grow a new head or a new tail, or even both. to rebuild the living whole. So we have this pattern generating activity in nature, and in living things it's regenerative, so living organisms are able to heal themselves. And so that pretty much is the ancient Greek view of nature's intelligence. There's a living intelligence at work in living things, and in what we would now call the biosphere, and even in the entire cosmos. And the Greeks typically would refer to this intelligence as being divine. For example, Thales, the philosopher, said all things are full of gods. But this view is something that's totally different from our modern or Judeo-Christian idea of God. And this is something that when most people read the Greek philosophers, they don't understand, because for the Greeks, the divine is not something that's outside of the universe, like a human ego that draws up a blueprint or plan of the cosmos. For the Greeks, the order of the universe was never imposed upon it by something outside of it, but the order of nature is a natural expression of its own inner life, intelligence, and being. So in a sense, this is very modern, because the Greek view very much resembles our modern theories of what they now call the evolutionary self-organizing universe. It's not like the Judeo-Christian concept of God, that there was an external intelligence, that drew up a plan, but it's part of, the system itself. And for the Greeks, what makes the universe divine is not an external creator, but the fact that the universe possesses a luminous beauty, intelligence, and eternal activity. And so the book, basically, it's a history, starting in ancient times, coming all the way up to the present, of this idea of living nature and nature's intelligence, and how it went into eclipse, why it went into eclipse, and how it's coming back. And there have been a lot of different views, about the world soul as well. And Plato was the first one to describe it in the Timaeus. And I could tell you a little bit more about that and exactly what Plato said about it and how he defined it, because later on people will look at it in a slightly different way, but it really all started with Plato in terms of first using that term.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, well, basically for Plato, what the world soul was is it was sort of more of a metaphysical principle. And Plato, he was very influenced by the Pythagoreans, and it all has to do with proportion and harmony, and then that gives rise to beauty in the natural world. And for Plato, the world soul was the intelligent and harmonious principle of proportion or relatedness at the heart of the cosmic pattern that allows all things to unfold in the best possible way. And that's why nature is so beautiful, is because there's this principle of proportion or logos behind it, which harmonizes all of the parts into a whole. Or maybe the other way to say it, actually, for Plato, is that the universe is one thing. It's a harmonically differentiated image of unity. And basically, in Western thought, there are two totally opposite views about the cosmos. And one view says that the universe resembles a living organism, and that's the view of the Greeks, and that was expressed by Plato. And the other view is sort of represented by René Descartes, who described the universe as a machine. And I have a couple of quotations here to show you how different these views really are. So I'm going to read you a quotation from Plato and Descartes, and you can see how they represent the two opposite ends of a spectrum. Plato says in the Timaeus, when he introduces this idea of the world soul, this is how he describes the universe in his way. He says that the universe is, quote, a perceptible God, image of the intelligible, in other words, an image of intelligence, greatest and best, most beautiful and most perfect. So this sort of like negates all of those people who think that Plato was a dualist, pitting spirit against matter and all that kind of stuff. I mean, this is the ultimate proof that Plato didn't think in that way. And the way that he describes the cosmos is, he says that it's one whole of wholes, like an organism. So this is the idea of holism. It's holistic like an organism. And he says that it's, quote, a single living creature which encompasses all of the other living creatures that are within it. So it's really this idea of an organism, containing suborganisms. And that's, the one view of the cosmos. And then roughly 2,000 years later, Descartes wrote, quote, "I've described this earth and indeed the whole visible world as a machine." So you can see really, how very different these two views are, and they lead to very different outcomes in society too, because Descartes believed that he could totally explain the universe as being a machine, and that he could remove all wonder and mystery from nature, which some scientists still want to do. They find that to be an appealing idea.
Oh yeah.
And he also felt that his scientific approach would make human beings the lords and masters of nature. That's a quote. So this book, Restoring the Soul of the World, it tells the entire story of, our changing visions of nature and our changing relationships to nature from the ancient Greeks, 2,500 years ago up to where we are today. And in the worldview of, Descartes and, the so-called mechanical philosophers that followed him, the world and our bodies became modeled as machines. And when that happened, human beings no longer had a real place in nature. We actually became, spectators or disembodied intellects like Descartes, and also like the god of deism, because the idea of God that was present then in Western culture was that of deism. And in the world, in the worldview of, or in the God image of deism, what God is God is just like a rational principle behind the cosmos that designed the universe at the beginning and set the world in motion, and then stepped back from the universe and has no contact with it at all. It's a totally separate reality, and the world machine runs on its own after that, and God is just sort of like a spectator that looks at the world from afar, which actually was what people were turning into as well. And Descartes, epitomizes that himself, because for Descartes, human beings were sort of like disembodied intellects that didn't have any real connection with the world, because the world was a machine. Our bodies were machines. Animals were machines. And for example, if you hit a dog and the dog barked, for Descartes, it was like a malfunctioning machine. It was, animals were incapable of, feeling any pain. So that was
that was pretty stark, and it seems, David, that's the turning point, as you say. Descartes saw us just souls trapped in a giant machine, and you offer other evidence, like Sir Francis Bacon saying nature was a female wanting to be dominated. It really changed the whole game, even with Newton. And that the ironic thing, David, is that people like Descartes and Newton, they were very spiritual people. They were Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and so forth, but they sort of, I guess, dropped the whole ball.
Yes. Well, it's an interesting thing that happened, and they were geniuses. There's no doubt about it. And the mechanistic worldview, there were some good aspects to it. I mean, it actually it all has to do with changes that were taking place in consciousness, I believe, and that's why I sort of like drew this parallel between the God of deism and sort of like the idea of the Cartesian ego or the spectator, because that God image sort of acted as an archetype that allowed this new vision of human nature to come forth. there were good aspects to it, because then human beings they were able to look at the world more analytically and, gain, a further degree of control, over nature, become, it was the birth of the autonomous self in a sense. And, like a lot of things, it was good to a certain degree, but if it's taken to an extreme, then it can become negative. And that's, I think, what happened. But I think there was some mysterious, process that was being played out. Because when you, read those things that Francis Bacon said about, controlling nature and making nature the slave of mankind, and comparing, scientific experimentation to, torturing a woman on the rack and things like that. It's so bizarre to us as modern readers, to read those phrases of his. I think he was under the spell of an archetype or something like that. He wasn't really quite. He seemed to be conscious in the sense of what he was writing, but there was something more, going on with it. But there was this split occurring at that time between humanity and the natural world, and suddenly we're seeing the world in a much more polarized way, and the world became an object rather than something that we're part of. And what we've seen historically, if we look at it, as soon as the world becomes an object, it also becomes an object of exploitation, just a resource for human use. And that's exactly what happened, because the mechanical philosophy objectified the world as a non-living machine. And there were actually, formal theories that arose at that time about how nature was only valuable as an object of human use, and it possessed no, intrinsic value of its own. And in fact, there's an entire chapter about that in the book, which is, fairly interesting, called "In the Name of Utility: The Exploitation of Nature and the Decline of Pleasure." And it explains, or explores rather, how this utilitarian mindset came into being, which actually, is a very important factor, behind, the modern worldview, the idea that nature has no intrinsic value of its own, and that the true value of something only possesses true value if you can convert it into something else, which is usually money. So,
as always.
Yeah. So it's like people, instead of, looking at a forest and saying, what an incredible manifestation of beauty and life this is, they look at it and see, well, how many, pencils or boards can I make out of it, and how can I convert this into some kind of, economic reward. And part of this view was the modern mythology of progress as well, which never existed in the ancient world. And I can't really remember to what degree I discussed this in the book or not, but I think that what happened is that, for the Greeks, time was circular or cyclical, and it's in the Judeo-Christian tradition where time is linear. And so you have the creation of the world, you have the coming of, in Christianity, you have the coming of Jesus, the Messiah, and then people look forward to the coming kingdom of God in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So it's very forward-looking, it's very linear. There's, past, present, and future. And what happened around the time of the scientific revolution, and especially with Francis Bacon, he really articulates this whole idea of progress and, the domination of nature, and that through the scientific method, we will become the masters and, possessors of nature, and we'll create utopia on Earth, through applied experimentation and technology, basically. And so what happened then is, I think it was this Christian idea of linear time leading somewhere, but then it took on a secular interpretation, so that people were no longer just waiting for the coming kingdom of God. It was our job to create that on Earth and turn the Earth into a technological paradise, which, if we look back, in terms of what happened, that was the motivating ethos, really, and it was very successful because we've now paved over most of the planet, and we've developed these incredible, technologies of turning, things from the natural world, into products and things like that.
Yes, your book does a very good job at, again, showing the history of this sort of struggle between the organic universe and the mechanistic universe. And I would tell the listener to certainly get your other book, Jesus Christ, Son of God, which talks also about the idea of the logos, the divine intelligence, the cosmos, and so forth. And it seems to me that there were some rebellions or sort of pushbacks against this mechanistic universe. We both know, and you write about the romantic poets like William Blake and so forth, denouncing Newton and others. And then the other one would be Sigmund Freud and psychology, right? That's when we started to figure out that we had an unconscious, that there was a life underneath us that was moving, right?
Right. Because in the mechanistic worldview, the mechanistic worldview, as it was sort of like summarized by Newton, consisted of dead matter in motion. Like a billiard ball universe. It was a revival of the ancient Greek idea of atomism in a sense, except now everything was mathematically modeled, and it was an astonishing breakthrough, really, because the mathematical models worked quite well, and they could be used to, celestial mechanics. You could predict the movement of the planets and solar eclipses in advance with a much greater accuracy than had been done in the past. And so it seemed like some kind of, revelation was at hand. I mean, Newton was pictured as a prophet, really, who directly saw into the mind of God, and he even said, or he wrote, "Oh God, I think my thoughts after you." So he felt that he was really looking into the mind of God. But what happened with this sort of like Cartesian worldview is that it led to a hyper-rationalized vision of what it meant to be a human being, so that for Descartes, human beings were only rational intellects. Other ways of perception did not possess the same kind of dignity as the rational intellect. So, for example, like feelings and emotions were considered to be, grit in the cognitive machinery of the mind, as it were. And so this new vision of human nature emerged, where human beings were just seen as being purely rational, and all intelligence existed within human beings alone, or God, and nature just operated as a clockwork mechanism. Nature was intelligent, but not with a living intelligence. It was intelligent only in virtue of the fact that it had been designed by God and set to run some thousand years earlier as a clockwork mechanism. And human beings were just these rational spectators that had no deeper connection to the world. And so one of the ways in which the idea of the world soul first started to come back was through the discovery of the unconscious, because in the mechanistic worldview, everything in the outer world was passive and operated on by external forces. But the Romantic poets and philosophers, discovered that within human beings, there are also forces at work, and that our conscious egos are actually not the source of all of our thoughts. We get, inspiration from, deeper sources, within the psyche. It's ironic because even Descartes' philosophical vision was, I think, inspired by like 3 dreams that he had. Which
wow.
Yeah. So, people have dreams, they have inspirations and things like that. And it was really through the Romantic philosophers and psychology that this idea that the world possesses an inner life of some sort, came to emerge. So with the Copernican revolution, people were displaced from the center of the cosmos, and then with Descartes, human beings were further displaced or alienated from the world in a sense, because they were just these sort of like rational, egos that were disconnected to everything. And then what happened with Kant is Kant, expressed the idea that we can't even know the world itself in some deep way. We can only know the categories of thought. And the Romantic philosophers really rebelled against this idea that we don't have an intrinsic connection with the world. They tried to overthrow this kind of Cartesian and Kantian paradigm by highlighting the fact, how deeply and well fitted, the human mind is with the external world. And I think they were, pretty successful in doing that. There's I think there's a poem by Wordsworth. Let me see if I can find it here. So the Romantics wanted to overcome these kind of like philosophical theories of alienation, and Wordsworth wrote how exquisitely the individual mind to the external world is fitted, and how exquisitely too, theme this but little heard of among men, the external world is fitted to the mind. And for the Romantics, we can know and experience the world in deeply intimate ways, because inner and outer are just different aspects of one creative activity. And so the Romantics started to revive this idea of the world soul and the living universe, but they enriched it with the idea that the creative imagination is a cosmic power present both in nature and humanity. So our own psyches and imaginations are outgrowths of the creative spirit behind the world.
Yeah, and even as you write, David, Plotinus in the 3rd century was talking about the unconscious, the creative intelligence beneath everything. So what happened, David? It seems, and again, you write this, that psychology with Freud and of course Jung and others really hasn't made a better world in 100 years. Maybe you could tell us why that has not happened in our age of Prozac and meds, and what is the turning point today?
Well, I was talking about that kind of funny book that James Hillman wrote. We've had 100 years of, psychology in the world has gotten worse. And sort of the argument behind that is that psychology, even though the originators of psychology realized that psychology was pointing the way, or was illustrating the fact that we have a deep inner connection with the life of the world. Psychology, as it developed into a professional practice, had a tendency to alienate or not alienate, but separate people from the world, in private consulting rooms, and what are your problems, and making people more narcissistically sensitive, while outside the world continued to go to hell. So that was sort of, and there were, there have been some movements in psychology to kind of like counter that, like eco-psychology, which Theodore Roszak developed. And he had this beautiful idea of the ecological unconscious, which connects us with, the living, patterns of the earth and our, entire evolutionary history. So the psychology part was the beginning, and then what happened after that was there were developments in the sciences, and there were half a dozen premises of the mechanistic Newtonian worldview, and every single one of those premises during basically like 100 or 150 year time period was destroyed. So
Indeed.
yeah, and the book really tells the whole story about how that happened in terms of physics and astronomy and things like that. But some of the premises of the mechanistic worldview, matter was dead and inert, acted upon by external forces only. The world machine was rigidly ordered and deterministic. Another feature of the mechanistic worldview centered on the role of the observer, who was pictured as being objectively distinct from the world that was under study. Time and space were seen as absolute unchanging realities. The universe was seen as a giant box that contained everything, an unchanging grid or frame of reference that could never itself expand or contract. And because all matter was dead, all creativity and spirit existed outside the universe in the mind of God at the beginning of time, blah, blah, blah. And all of those premises have been undermined by our, recent discoveries in cosmology and, quantum physics and things like that. And we now know that matter itself has a history. There's we live in a world of deep time. The universe goes back roughly 15 billion years, and all matter is evolutionary. This is actually something that the alchemists intuited. I have a chapter on alchemy, and the alchemists felt that all matter was evolving towards higher forms and that this was just a natural process. And what the alchemists wanted to do is participate in this process as midwives, in a sense. And it was sort of like gardening. Lead is going to turn into gold naturally, but if we give it some further attention and work with the process, we can accelerate the process along and help nature come into a state of flourishing. And this sort of therapeutic view of our relationship to nature was something shared by some of the Renaissance philosophers like Marsilio Ficino and Paracelsus and some of the other philosophers of the Renaissance, and their view was that the role of humanity was to participate in the ongoing creation and life of the world and raise the world to a higher state of fruition through some sort of therapeutic attention. But that was not the worldview to be. Instead, we ended up with this Baconian worldview that it was the purpose of humanity to master and exploit nature and to try and get as much as we can out of the natural world.
And here we are, David, in our present moment. And your book, of course, offers solutions and alternative views on how to restore or see the universe once again as a living, intelligent system. You write some like the anthropic principle, the Gaia theory. Of course, you talk about physics and how it's changed our view of the world. And one of those, which is very interesting, is that you connect the idea of space travel to the Stoic concept of cosmopolis. How did you do that, David?
Yeah. Well, the Stoic philosophers, they drew on this Pythagorean and Platonic idea that we live in a world community in which everything is interconnected. What happened in modern times is that we've become progressively alienated from nature. But the Stoics believed that we lived in a cosmopolis, and that the reason that we're human beings is because of the fact that we share a common rational spark, with other people, and that there's a common law that governs the cosmos, and there's a cosmic pattern of which we're a part, from human beings to the biosphere to the larger cosmos. But in modern times, we've become increasingly alienated from nature. And I use the figure of the astronaut as kind of a symbol, because the astronaut launched into space has reached the trajectory of the greatest possible separation from the living planet. The astronaut is embodied in, a machine suit, with, no connection to the living world, whatsoever. It's a totally artificial world. But at that very point of the greatest separation, the astronaut looks back and is able to see the vision of the whole Earth, so it's like an epiphany. And it's sort of like a child, seeing the face of its mother for the first time. So I think I have a chapter, that discusses, returning to Earth in the space age. And there are a lot of really amazing quotations from astronauts in terms of, the profound effect that, seeing the Earth from space had on them, as a single organism, as it were, without these arbitrary, political boundaries and things like that. And for the Stoics, the Stoics even had this spiritual practice that they called the view from above, where they would imagine themselves like over the Earth and looking down on the Earth, so that they could see, they could see things from a vantage point of like a greater reality, so that the small things that happen in their lives wouldn't bother them so much. But the thing that's amazing is they had this idea of a world community in which all living beings are interrelated and interdependent and rely upon each other to live, and all of these different philosophical concepts. But the thing that's so interesting about what has happened now in the space age is that we can actually see these images of the entire Earth. And when people see the image of the Earth from above, they're actually able to see this idea of the cosmopolis. It's just not a concept anymore, but it's something that you can actually see with your own eyes, and it has a very profound impact on people in terms of. So what I was saying is that the Stoics had this idea of a world community of which we are all a part, and it was this very beautiful and sublime philosophical conception that inspired their ethics, because really, if we're not connected to other people at a very deep level, there's no reason to be ethical beings at all, really. But the thing that has happened now in the space age is that we have these incredible images of the Earth from above, and the cosmopolis is no longer a philosophical concept. It's something that you can see with your own eyes. And when people are able to see the Earth from above, they are able to see that it's part of a community that we all belong to. So I think that and it inspires a sense of the sacred. When the Stoic philosophers practiced this view from above, they wanted to have this feeling of belonging to a whole, which goes beyond the limit of our individuality. So basically, this also raises the question of what does it mean to live in a global community as opposed to just a global civilization. So there is a difference, and if you look at what the Stoics were saying, you need to have basically three elements in place, and one of those elements is a real felt bond with a larger transcendent order of which we're a part, and a vision of living nature and an appreciation of nature's intelligence. That was part of the Stoic worldview, and an ethical concern for society based on our intrinsic kinship with others. And so these were all parts of what made something into a cosmopolis or a world community. But the thing that's interesting now is that when people see the Earth from above, they're inspired to immediately understand these 3 points just by looking at the image of the Earth from above. It's like it all comes into their mind. So I think that's quite important historically, and that in the future we'll look back at that as being a turning point in human history, because it really allows people to understand the sort of situation that we're in, including our ecological situation. One of the things that I did when I was working on the book is I went through I researched some of the really reliable ecological statistics from NGOs and things like that. And so I included some of the really well-researched ones in the book. But since the book was published, there was one that came out which really tells you enough, without reference to any of the other ones. And that is that, there was a study published just a few months ago saying that within the last 40 years, the population on the Earth has doubled, human population has doubled, and living animals in the wild, the population of all living animals has actually decreased 50% during that same time period. So
wow,
it's unbelievable, really. And people can have sort of like their pointless debates about, is climate change happening and things like that, and it's sort of irrelevant. Well, it's not irrelevant, but if you look at this one statistic alone, the fact that half of the Earth's wildlife has disappeared in the last 40 years, that's all that you need to know, that we are facing a really, profoundly serious, situation in terms of, the future of life on this planet, both, the planet's life and our own in terms of, a future life that would really be worth living. And so one of the things that I argue in the final chapter of the book is that we have to go way beyond, this idea of ecological sustainability, which basically means that you should, maintain the status quo and pass that on to your children or future generations, because it just doesn't go far enough. And so I think what we really need is a much deeper understanding of regenerative ecological design, so that we can help restore the life to the living systems of the Earth that have been so damaged and compromised. And it's not going to happen through some miraculous technological quick fix or anything like that. But I have a photograph of the smog in Beijing, and the smog is like so bad there that in the central square they've created this huge video monitor showing the sunrise because they can no longer see the sun. And you look at, these images of people wearing their masks and, this huge video image of the sun rising, it's like from Blade Runner or something. You can no longer see the natural world, And it's like, well, maybe that's sustainable, but is that the kind of world that we want to pass on to future generations? So that's why I don't think the idea of sustainability is adequate. And the last chapter of the book is devoted to the idea of collaborating with nature's intelligence, which, because of the fact that we live in a mechanistic worldview, well, it's not that, the mechanistic worldview has been, it's been proved not to be true. But the problem is that we still live in it conceptually, and so it makes it hard for us to think about nature in other ways, or the idea of nature's intelligence. It sounds strange to the modern ear, but basically we have to, find a way to end our adversarial relationship with nature and enter into partnership with it, because the model that we have been, using is based on the idea of control. And I think that, the days in which we can think of ourselves as the masters and controllers of nature are gone. And the only alternative to control is a spirit of partnership in which we work in collaboration with nature's living systems, like gardeners or like the alchemists or like the Renaissance philosophers, to therapeutically care for nature and help nature to restore itself. Because we can't we can't solve the ecological crisis through technological means in the same way that if you have a patient that's sick, the only way that you're not going to make something better just by treating the symptoms without the underlying cause. So we have to take a serious look at the worldview that has brought the situation into being in the first place, which was sort of like the project behind this book. But in the conclusion of the book, I talk about the idea of learning from and collaborating with nature, which we see in the new sciences of biomimicry and ecological design. And I would like to talk about that just briefly because I think that's extremely important. So what I was saying is the idea of learning from nature is very ancient, but the idea of collaborating with nature in a therapeutic kind of way it's also part of our Western tradition, but it's been pushed underground primarily because of the mechanistic worldview. And as Janine Benyus, the biology writer, points out, as soon as the world becomes a machine, you can only learn about it. You can never learn anything from it. But once we see nature as embodying a living intelligence, we can learn from it again. And that's one of the premises of biomimicry, which is that all of the living forms around us embody, a 3.8 billion year old, history of intelligence, and that the living organisms around us have, through their own native intelligence, discovered solutions to the kinds of problems that we as human beings are trying to deal with. And I'd like to just mention one example of that, and that is if you look at photosynthesis in plants, photosynthesis takes sunlight and transforms it into energy, which is something that we're trying to do through, photovoltaic, panels and things like that. And recently there have been some breakthroughs in photovoltaic panels so that they're now like 40% efficient in terms of transforming sunlight into energy. But if you look at plants, they're actually 90% efficient. And so if we could learn from the natural world, the intelligence of nature, how to, achieve that kind of increased, efficiency, that would help lessen our ecological footprint. And so there are all sorts of ways that people are now looking to nature's design solutions in order to, apply that intelligence into, solving human problems. And the most interesting case of this in terms of like deep ecological design is found in the work of John Todd, who in 1969 was part of a group called the New Alchemy Institute that operated for about 30 years. And they made some incredible breakthroughs. I use him as, or his work as a case study in the final chapter of the book. And they created something known as a bioshelter, which contains different living ecologies, including translucent tanks that contain like fish, algae, and other natural organisms. And they also contain like a marsh area and a pond area as well. And what he found is that when you take and what they are is they're placed inside a greenhouse. So all of this is driven by the energy of the sun. And what he found is that when you connect these three separate ecosystems together, each one has their own sort of natural intelligence, and a meta-intelligence forms. And these bioshelters then become what he calls eco-machines or living machines, and they're able to accomplish different kinds of tasks. And for example, one of the tasks that they're able to accomplish is turning like human sewage into pure water. And basically, in the space of 2 to 3 days, you can put human sewage through one of these biological systems, and it comes out 5 times cleaner than the water purified, using traditional chemical means. But one of the early experiments that they did, and they've done all sorts of this work since then, but I'd like to highlight this as sort of like an example of what's possible, is they went to this toxic waste site, which was it was located on Cape Cod, and it was very, very polluted with 15 carcinogenic chemicals. So they created one of these living machines with all of these different living organisms, algae, fish, marshlands, etc. And they passed this toxic waste through it. And what they discovered, it took 10 days for the waste to flow through the system. And of the 15 volatile compounds listed as carcinogenic by the EPA, 14 had been entirely removed by this aquatic ecosystem. And when the fish residing at the end of the system were analyzed for PCBs, dioxin, and other related toxins, they were found to be free of all contaminants. So of these 15 substances, 14 were completely removed, and the 15th substance was 99% removed, and none of these other contaminants were found in the fish at the end of the system. And the way that this works is that all of these living organisms are intelligent, and they respond to the conditions around them, and they recognize the toxins and produce enzymes to break down their chemical bonds, turning the toxins into foods and less harmful substances. And so John Todd continued to do this work, and what he discovered is that given the right conditions, purification cycles, which might take centuries, just in the wild, can be speeded up, using these living machine technologies, so that the purification can be achieved in weeks or months instead of centuries. So that's really amazing. And so this is a very concrete way, or a concrete illustration of one way in which human beings have discovered a way to collaborate with nature's intelligence. Because one of the things that John Todd says is that these communities of organisms are just much more intelligent than we are, and we can't engineer the solution through a process of control. But if we work with the intelligence of nature in a way based on collaboration and partnership, and if we have trust in the natural world, the intelligence exists in nature to help, heal itself. It's the same way that people are healed. We're all healed ultimately, by ourselves, with a bit of, therapeutic, intervention. And so that's what this sort of, vision of deep ecological design is like in terms of collaborating with nature's intelligence.
Well, I certainly agree, and I would highly recommend the listener to look at the problems and the solutions in a very interesting historical arc in your book, Restoring the Soul of the World. But I think that's all the time we have today, David. I'd like to thank you very much again, and for coming on again and honoring Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio.
Well, it's great talking with you.
Can you read the night?